Okay, ready? We're going to stop talking badly about the people who tend asynchronously. Welcome to Foundations of Politics. If you're watching this recording, we love you so much. We miss all your beautiful faces. See another example of a joke. That was an inside joke between me and the people who attend this class synchronously. Where were we? Oh, yes. Okay, let's begin. Papers. Those of you who are feeling high on the scale from 1 to 10, I hope you still feel good after this. Papers are due Monday at the end of the day. 4 to 5 pages, variety of topics on which you can write. If you're writing about Aristotle, it'd be good to use the Stephanus numbers. So that's like, 1278, A, 3 through 4, as an example. If you're citing Augustine, it's probably best to cite the book and chapter number. So I think, like, for example, the one about how kingdoms without justice are nothing but bands of robbers. That's like, I think, book 4, chapter 4, or something like that. So that'd be helpful to do it that way. If you're writing the open letter to yourself and to others, just let me know that you're quoting C.S. Lewis or Cass or whatever. It's a PDF that's kind of unofficial. So just let me know. It's not too big of a deal. Citations for that. What questions do you have about this? About the paper for Monday?
If we're doing the letter to ourselves, can we use both Cass and Lewis, or do we just have to choose one?
Yeah, use both if you want to. I think you probably should mention both. If you want to focus on one rather than the other, it's
perfect.
Fine, or both, it's fine.
I'm behind on it. Is there any chance, I know it's really unprofessional, but if I sent you an email tomorrow, is there any chance you could get back to me before it was due, even though it's weekend?
Yeah, send me an email. We can talk early Monday. Would that work?
Oh yeah, that would be great. I just I know I'm behind, and I just want to if I needed to, I like the idea that it wouldn't be well, not until it's due,
Right. No. Yeah. Let's meet.
Okay.
Yeah. So, is your question? Hey, could we meet sometime on Monday early to discuss it?
It's just I picked the letter one as well, but I haven't really thought through any of it yet.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I do have a question, I just don't want to get to Monday night being well, I know I don't have class with him until Tuesday, so I don't want to,
Why can't I just a second? Let me try to do a million things at once.
Yes.
Those of you who are writing the letter, yeah, what are you thinking? Let me pull that up. You do not need to talk about Martin Lloyd-Jones. That's just maybe a helpful way of thinking about why this would be a good thing to do. What kind of advice do you need to hear right now? And maybe what kind of advice do your fellow students need to hear? And how does this help you do that? I can answer the question too. If I were writing this letter to myself, I love what C.S. Lewis says. It says something like, happy plans. You know what? Let me look it up.
My my question when I was like looking at the topic was I don't really know how like the quotation like from the what was it le chem to life and its limits, because that whole passage was about like, wasn't it bioethics and how like they want to do anything possible to like preserve life. So how would that correlate with C.S. Lewis's? I feel like C.S. Lewis's is a much more like co- easy to correlate with like the topic of like offering advice in the trying times than the to life and its limits. Are we essentially saying that like death is inevitable?
Yeah. I'm looking at my actually. Uh,
Can you send us the link to that too? That
yeah.
so
Um, oh, I can't find it. He says something like, um, says something like, happy work is done best when you live in the moments and hold the future lightly, or something like that. That's what I need to hear. My wife and I keep trying to figure out the future, and it hasn't worked. It hasn't worked yet. We haven't been able to figure out what's happening. So every time we start doing that, we're like, okay, it's good to be prepared. We're prepared. So now let's like move on. Let's dwell on something else. Let's live our lives to the best of our ability in light of all this. That's the advice I've been needing to hear. Not to try to control the future. Yeah, so Sarah's question, I think L'chaim and its limits is less directly applicable, but I think there's still stuff there for us to learn. Um, yeah, bringing the knowledge of our finitude closer can help us live more meaningful lives. Hey, but if you just wanted to talk about C.S. Lewis's letter, C.S. Lewis's sermon, that's great. What have you been noticing in your fellow students? Like, what kind of troubles are they having?
Absolute pessimism.
Pessimism. Same. Well, I definitely don't give any specific examples, but like, you want to spell that out a little more?
Just last night I was talking with a couple of friends, like on a group Zoom call, and I was like, well, yeah, there's like some hope, like, they're talking about like a phased like lowering of the shutdown and stuff like that, and I think that there's like, some hope that as it goes it's gonna get better. And they're just like, yeah, but as soon as they open things up, everybody's gonna get sick immediately. And it's like, okay, well, that's kind of a negative, like, worst possible outcome.
Yeah, pessimism about the future, maybe lack of faith in that people at the helm will do a good job opening things back up.
One thing that I was writing an article for a class of mine, and I got to interview a psychologist who's like who made the comparison that people, like everyday people, are going through the grieving process, but they don't know how to name it. So they're going through all the same things of the grieving process. Like at first it's shock and like mayhem, and then they're saying that like it's not surprising that everybody got angry like last week, because like the second phase, or like one of the phases of grief, is just getting mad at the situation. So they made like all these comparisons, and then they were talking about like all this stuff goes unnoticed, and it's like anxiety unnoticed equals fear, and then fear creates like even worse um like eventually leading to more of a depression. So the people with good tools are going to be able to bounce out of this really well. People with bad tools will just go further into it.
Mm.
And so I I've been thinking about that a lot, because I have noticed like my friends got like mad, and now like at first we're all like, what in the world is going on? And then we all got mad and kind of pissed off because we're grieving all the things that like we made little plans, you know, and now none of those things can happen anymore.
Oh man, yes, that sounds great. It sounds like you're saying that you need to recognize your anxiety, and how might C.S. Lewis's sermon speak to anxiety? So there's your letter. Hey, also,
Yeah. Do
you all
you
heard
think I could use parts of that interview?
Yes. Yeah,
Like,
I'd be okay with that. Who was it?
his name's Dave Boshin. He was like a really like big into like family counseling, and then he moved into like the foster care system. Now he's like the #1 like head of foster care in California.
Oh wow,
So,
cool.
yeah. And so he's like making sure that all these kids right now are finding homes. And then like
Wow.
he has like all the research behind like how like brains work. So it really helps him in his career. I don't know. It was fascinating.
Did you hear what I said as I was re-summarizing what I think you were saying?
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
was like the root is anxiety, so you need to recognize it, and then how do you address
Yeah.
anxiety?
Oh, what he was telling me?
Well, yeah, or
Yeah.
C.S. Lewis has some spiritual advice. There may be other ways to deal with anxiety that overlapping with the spiritual advice would be a really good letter. So there you go.
Yeah. That sounds great. By the end of the call, he actually was talking about his own faith because he is a Christian, which is crazy to like get there in the interview. But one of the biggest things, it sounds weird to like address the anxiety, was to get on like a sleep cycle. And he was just like, seriously, the #1 thing you can do. So just
Beth's
start by
like
that. And then
taking
it's
notes.
like, I know. I'm like,
I'm sorry. I
yeah,
don't mean to call you
yeah,
out.
no, yeah. So it was super super interesting, and so I'll make sure to like get all these thoughts together.
Sure.
Doing that.
Great.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Jacob, it sounded like you were doing this one too, right? Do you have any preliminary thoughts about what you want to write? I don't know if you can hear me. It's okay if you can't. Beth, were you going to say something?
I was just like, I think the major thing I've had to deal with is disappointment. Because, you know, I signed up for this crazy 1-semester New York program and I got 2 months out of it. And I've stayed in New York, but like, this isn't at all what I thought it was going to be. Gotten to know my apartment really well. But also like, so I was supposed to graduate in May. That's donezo. And I was hoping to like find a job while I was up here, but like a lot of people are scared to hire anybody. And there are all these things that I wanted to happen out of my time in New York. And I know that there like has to have been a reason that I was still able to come. I'm just having a hard time seeing what it was.
Yeah.
So I don't really know how to approach being like, yeah, I'm disappointed.
Yeah. Well, I mean, taking the advice from Sarah's interviewee, sounds like you should admit that. It seems like you have. It's always the first step. Here it is. There's Lewis. Happy work is best done by the man or woman who takes her long-term plans somewhat lightly and works moment to moment as to the Lord. And I keep needing to repeat that to myself. Because, yeah, I mean, like, I was supposed to graduate too, by the way. I just got my PhD in June. So I was like, I had to wait until May to graduate. I mean, like, to walk. I was going to meet up with all my friends in Waco. And so, yeah, I hear you. Lydia, you had a question about the deadline? It's okay if you don't want to talk about that here, but if you do, what's up? Yes, email me. Hey, by the way, yeah, if you have problems, email me. Like, I feel like I'm a pretty flexible person to begin with. And also, there's a global pandemic. So if you're having troubles, email me. I can't help you if you don't email me. I'm not talking to you, Lydia. Sorry. I'm just saying, in general, please let me help you. Okay, well, I hope that's helpful. Let's talk about that's wrong slide. Let's talk about Thomas Aquinas' political thoughts. I'm glad we spent those 15, 20 minutes or so, maybe 30 minutes now, talking about the paper. That's important to do, so I don't feel like we wasted that time. But let's move on to Aquinas' political thoughts. Thomas Aquinas, for today, 2 key themes. First, the 4 essences of law, and second, the 4 kinds of law. On the quiz, let me just tell you right now, the question is, what are the 4 essences of law? Remember how to read Aquinas. Pay close attention to the I respond or the respondeo or I answer that. It's where Aquinas answers the question that he asks. These other parts are important, but the response is very important. Aquinas, this is too reductionistic, too simplistic, but kind of helpful. Aquinas is like the Christian Aristotle. Augustine, by the way, it's too reductionistic to say this, and I cringe as I'm saying it, but Augustine is the Christian Plato. Aquinas is the Christian Aristotle. I don't like saying that because it makes it seem like Aristotle is just the less good version, or Aquinas is the less good version of Aristotle. By the way, it's the first time today that I've misspoke about Aquinas. There'll be more. But they have similar methods. They start with common opinion. They're very systematic. And their argument is very similar, especially here. I mean, we're also talking about like the golden mean. Virtue is a mean between 2 extremes, the middle ground between 2 extremes. But even in political philosophy, both agree that human beings are social. This means that government is not a result of sin. Thomas Paine says that what is government but a badge of our lost innocence? In other words, it's a result of the fall. For Aquinas and for Aquinas and Aristotle, it's not exactly true. There is rule and being ruled in turn, and that is part of our nature. Our discussing justice and injustice, advantage and disadvantage. These things are a part of who we are as human beings. And so our natures are fulfilled in community. Now, Aquinas is very quick to point out, it's not that our natures are fulfilled by community, but rather that our natures are fulfilled in community. Very similar, though, to what Aristotle says. In addition, they both, what's the right way to say this? Fangirl over the law. The law, they love the law. The law ought to protect the common good and to secure peace. That's the goal. And they both see the dangers of breeding habitual irreverence for the law. Aquinas says that there are 4 essences of law. An essence is that which makes something what it is. It's the fundamental characteristics of a thing. It is that without which a thing wouldn't be that thing. Like these are the fundamental components, and if you take away any of these things, you don't have that overarching thing anymore. Hope that makes sense. Yeah, if you didn't have any of these components, then strictly speaking, the law would not be a law. The law would not be a law. These four essences of law correspond with the four causes that Aristotle expounds on in his Physics and Metaphysics. So yeah, like it is reductionistic to say that Aquinas is the Christian Aristotle, but not too crazy to say that. The entire mode of the argument, Aquinas is drawing from Aristotle. The four causes are like four different ways of describing an object or a thing. It doesn't have to be a physical thing. It could be a metaphysical thing, like a concept, but there are four different ways of describing something. The first is the form, or the formal cause. You might want to think of the formal cause as the blueprints. This is the arrangement or shape or appearance of a thing, the plan. So let's pretend like, I don't know, let's make it silly. Some Martians show up right here and they ask you, hey, what is a table? What is table? Like, well, okay, one way to describe it would be, you know, it's about like 6 feet. This table is about 6 feet wide, long, about 3 feet wide. It's about 2-3 inches thick. It's maybe like, I don't know, 3 feet off the ground or so. There are 4 legs to it. Yeah, that's like the arrangements of the table. This is the blueprints of the table. It can be one way of answering the question. The final cause. Number 2, the final cause. This is the purpose, or if you want to get fancy with it, the telos. The purpose, the end toward which a thing develops or is made. So notice that like the final cause, there could be growth here. So the end of an acorn is an oak tree. It's the purpose, it's the end, the final thing that the acorn becomes. Or it could be static. So the purpose of a table, what is that? Let's go back to our Martian friends. They say, what is table? And I say, well, it's a object you can use to like put your book on, or maybe like your water bottle, and it holds it for you. You might eat on a table. You might place your food on the table and it like props it up and you can eat there. Maybe you can sit at a table and you can like discuss something with the person on the other side of the table. That could be a purpose for a table. So one way of answering the question is purpose. I write at my table. The third cause is the efficient cause. This is the agent or author, the actual force that brings the thing about. Let's talk about the table. Who made this table? If it were wooden and old and beautiful, ornate, you might say that, oh, a carpenter made it. A carpenter was the efficient cause of this table. He took his tools, and fashioned the wood, and made this table. This was definitely not made by a carpenter. You know, a factory, some sort of assembly line assembled this together, and that is the actual force that brought about the table. So someone said, hey, what's the table? And it's like, oh, it's something that's made in an assembly line. It's one way of answering the question. The final cause, or sorry, the fourth cause, the cause that's last on the list is the material cause. And this describes the matter, the physical or metaphysical properties of the thing. Someone asks, sorry, the Martians ask, what is a table? You might say, well, it's a polypropylene plastic. That's the top of it, and then the bottom, the legs are made of some sort of metal, some sort of hollowed out metal. So someone asks you what a table is? Yeah, that's what it is. It's plastic. It's made up of plastic. By the way, I should mention that the other way of describing what a table is from The Office when Dwight asks Andy, who he's interviewing, how do you make a table? And he says, you make a chair, but you don't sit on it. Unfortunately, Aquinas doesn't mention this, so I just think that I should bring that up here.
So
Or
that would
causes.
be sufficient substitute. Maybe.
Yes, but you're like, it's also got some purpose in there too, right? Blueprints in there too. Yeah, it's hard to say what exactly he's referring to there. But no understanding of a thing is complete if you lack any of these four elements. Okay, that's enough about tables. Let's talk about the law. There are four essences of law, and they correspond to the four causes put forward by Aristotle. The first, by the way, we're starting in question 90, and Aquinas is so lovely and systematic and formulaic. Question 90 is, hey, what are the four essences of law? Question 90, Article 1, oh, it's an ordinance of reason. Question 90, Article 2, oh, there's the final cause for the common good. Question 90, Article 3, there's the efficient cause. Hey, the number 4, the matter, the material cause. Very easy to follow. Okay, so the formal cause of law is law is of reason. I find it helpful that he calls it a rule and a measure of human actions. So it's reasonable, it's not random, there's an order to it, and this order is both a rule and a measure. So it's a rule because it tells you what you ought to do, it gives you commands, directs your actions. So it commands what we ought to do. That's the rule part of it. And then it's also a measure. It's a standard or measuring rod. So we know when we either obey or disobey the law. So law has these two functions. It tells you what to do, and it is a standard by which you can know whether or not you did the thing or did not do the thing. So at my house growing up, trash night was Tuesday nights. Every Tuesday night, you had to take out the trash. Take out the trash was a law of our house. It was told to me. Take out the trash is both a rule. I knew what to do. I had to take out the trash. And also, it was a measure. Take out the trash. Well, did I do it or not? It was a way of seeing whether or not it actually happened. Second, law is for the common good. That is the purpose of the law. Now, this is one of those political sciencey terms that I think people use a lot, but we don't really talk about what it means. What is the common good? Let's discuss that. I'm going to throw us out into these breakout rooms and discuss what is the common good. Now, if you don't have a good answer for it, that's totally fine. It's a near impossible thing to define, but I think we should still try. So what I'm asking for is your opinion, or like, hey, I've heard common good often described in these terms. What do we mean by the common good? If you want to talk about Aquinas, that's great. Or if you just want to say, hey, when I hear about the common good, this is what usually people mean by it. So I'm going to stop sharing. Hey, welcome back. What is the common good? And remember, I'm not looking for a specific right answer. This is just like, hey, when you think of the common good, what do you think of?
Yeah. Our group, I think, had 2 answers, if I'm remembering correctly. Like either whatever is the most beneficial for the most people, or whatever interferes with people's choices the least.
Our group was having a discussion about whether common good, I guess, like works from the outside in or like the inside out. I don't know if that seems like the best way to explain it, but I think Mark was saying that the common good is met when you meet like the needs of individuals. And I was thinking of it more in like a outside in, like not everyone's needs and interests are going to be met when the common good is being upheld. Like the common good requires compromise, I guess.
Well, I think it should be a little bit of both, where we have a minimum standard of well-being for all individuals, and the society should focus, when trying to pursue the common good, should provide those necessary resources to everyone on like an individual level, what they need, and then anything above that should be up to the individual. So, basic needs should be provided, and then freedom of choice should be given past the basic needs of individuals. But my whole thing is individual based, because what Sean said, whatever is good for the whole isn't always good for individuals, and vice versa. So which one should we be focusing on? I think we should do a little bit of both, where the necessary needs of survival should be for everyone, but then outside of that, we should be given the freedom to choose, family and self-actualization and stuff like that beyond basic necessary goods.
So we have utilitarianism here.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. The reason that our group with me and Sean were kind of disagreeing with one another and came up with two was because it felt like we're talking directly about like Brave New World and utilitarianism, where it's like the best for all doesn't necessarily mean the best in general. So then the option of having choice is absolutely necessary. It's just infinitely complicated.
Yeah, my group said similar-ish things, but what we were saying also is that it's really hard to define what the common good looks like. Like right now, we have a pretty good example of what that looks like staying inside, wearing a mask. That's for the common good of people, to keep them from getting sick and give them, the option to continue to live. Whereas like if we were in normal societal circumstances, it would be a lot more difficult to define exactly what the common good looks like.
Another thing that I want to talk about, I was in Mark's group, by the way, but focusing on the individual and almost, I would say, training or instilling the values of making other individuals value others. So you push them to become more, to do more. And if every individual does that to everyone in society, I feel that's a common good to be working towards. Because instead of a central government coming in and trying to instill these values, when each individual is working towards one goal, one cause, it's hard for a force like that to fail.
Yeah. Do you think that's possible when our mode of thinking about our goods is in the language of rights?
I think it's possible.
Okay. What I mean is,
whether or not you can do it ethically is the problem.
oh, okay. I don't understand. What do you mean?
It's possible, but in my opinion, in order to actually create something like that, you would need to have a level of indoctrination to society similar to conditioning in Brave New World.
Oh, I see. To look out for the interest of everyone else and also the whole.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we've heard utilitarianism, which is, what's best for everyone. Although, it's impossible to do what's best for everyone. So we'll just like approximate that by talking about what's best for the majority. The greatest good for the greatest number. This is the same way that democracy claims to be the rule of the people, but is actually the rule of the majority. Mark put forward something like, something like Milton Friedman or John Rawls, where we maintain a minimum level of society and then let people grow from on top of that. But I mean, as Sarah pointed out, this thing is infinitely complicated. And it brings up Mark's question from a couple of classes ago, which is how we understand the relationship between the individual and the political community, right? So we see extreme versions of favoring the political community, or I guess I should just say the community, in the Sinian speech, constructed by Socrates and Glaucon and Mantis. And we also see an extreme version in Brave New World, where the good of the whole is put before the good of the individual. This is a notoriously difficult thing to talk about. The common good may be strictly speaking impossible on Earth because we're fallen beings. But I really like the way Aquinas tries to lay out his framework here. So turn with me to question 90, article 2. If you have the book, it's on page 4, but question 90, article 2, in the response, second paragraph, I believe. Now, in actions which practical reason is concerned with, the first principle is the ultimate end. But as was established above, the ultimate end of human life is happiness or beatitude. Hence, law must have to do mainly with an ordering that leads to beatitude. And, again, since every part is ordered toward its whole in the way that what is incomplete is ordered to what is complete, and since a man is part of a complete community, law must properly be concerned with the ordering that leads to communal happiness. So how does Aquinas answer the question? He says that the common good is both the individual good of each human being and also the good of the whole. What is the city made up of? It's made up of people. So to ignore the individual good of each individual person is to protect some abstract group of people and not actually individual people. So any conception of the common good must seek the good of the individual. He talks here about the ultimate end of human life is happiness or beatitude. That's what we're aiming towards. And the law aims toward that. But too scared about this. Aquinas is not arguing for some sort of totalitarian theocracy. Notice the word ordering there. It's like the law should secure the preconditions for happiness. It has to do mainly with an ordering that leads to beatitude. So the state, according to Aquinas, should not try to force you to be ultimately happy. By the way, beatitude is like a fancy word for happiness resulting from communion with God. So happiness is kind of like the vaguer part of the word, and beatitude means ultimate fulfillment through communion with God. And the law should aim towards ordering us to that end. But note that it can't force us to that end. So on one hand, Aquinas is kind of modern in this sense. He says, no, we have to focus on individual happiness. And he does that first. But individual happiness for Aquinas, it's not ultimate individual happiness isn't diverse. It's one thing. We aim at fulfillment through communion with God. But, and this is where it gets tricky, human beings are complete in and of themselves. We are made in the image of God and are fully ourselves. We're complete. But we are complete also in community. So it is only in community that we reach our full potential. So there's this weird both and, this paradox where human beings are complete and our happiness is worth pursuing on its own terms, but also the common good aims at the good in common, the communal good. What does this mean? This is the part that's even trickier. It's really hard to describe. On one hand, it's like the peace and security and stability that enables human flourishing. So I think, Mark, you were talking about a specific way of answering this part of the question, which is that it needs to meet certain preconditions. It needs to secure certain basic goods for all of the people involved. That is one way of understanding the common good. But it's not simply like these tangible things. It's also kind of intangible. Let me try to make sense of this by giving you an example. Marriage. Marriage is what brings us together here today. Marriage. So when my wife and I got married, I had my own interests. She had her own interests. Both of those individual interests are worthwhile, important, worthy of pursuing on their own terms. But when I got married to my wife, we created this third good, which is the good of the union. So it's not simply my good, and it's not simply her good, and it's not simply like her good plus my good as like individual goods that kind of just like stack. It's rather the creation of a third thing, the marriage together, the union of a third thing that forms the common good. So one of the best pieces of advice I got in premarital counseling was, when you get married, you kind of need to be more committed to the marriage than you are to the other person, which is a weird thing to think about. But the other person is going to change. They're going to grow up a bit more. And thank goodness, right? I got married when I was 22 because I was an idiot, but it was awesome. I just think, like, looking back on it now, I was 22? Wow, why did anyone let me do that? It was awesome, though. It is awesome. What I'm trying to say, though, is people change. An example, a silly example. When my wife and I got married, we liked watching the same TV shows. Now, we don't. For example, I tried to watch Waco on Netflix, which is about the David Koresh, Branch Davidians standoff with the Bureau for Alcohol and Tobacco and Firearms in like the early 90s. Oh man, I was obsessed. I loved it. We will finish the episode and Katie's like, yeah, sorry, I can't watch this anymore. Because there are a bunch of kids and the kids might get hurt, and so we have to watch The Office, which is great, but we've seen it 10 times. Our interests are diverging. I'm not committed to her and her particular tastes as much as I am committed to this marriage. Because what's good for me is different than what's good for her. It could be that case. And also what's good for me could be different than what's good for the union. But do you see how that's different than simply what's good for her? This is an insanely difficult thing to grasp, and I'm not sure that I'm satisfied with the way I'm explaining it, but like the common good is the individual good of every member, the baseline framework or conditions that enable everyone to grow, the communal good, but then also it's like this intangible third thing that's created. That's different than the individual happiness of each person, the aggregate of the individual happiness of each person. It's this third thing. Is it ever secured here on earth in the way that I'm describing it? I don't know. I don't know that I've ever seen it. I mean, even in our marriage, we fail doing this often and have to forgive and pick ourselves back up and try again. Especially when there are like more than two people involved, right? And government is not a marriage. Tariffs. Tariffs really help certain industries, domestic industries, but they often harm consumers. Taxes. It is impossible for a tax to be completely fair. It's going to either burden the, it's either going to, either way you look at equality, it's going to be unequal for someone. You know what I mean? Like, if you have just a standard percentage that everyone pays, well, that seems unfair to the poor because they have less money to begin with. But if there's a progressive tax, well, that seems kind of unfair to the rich or the people who work hard. And so what I'm saying is there's no one way to make everyone happy. But this is the goal, that the law aims towards the common good. Okay. Third, the efficient cause. This is the author. You can't just go out and shout at a car driving by and that's the law. That's not the law. It has to be made by him or those who have care of the community. I'm being intentionally like stilted here to show that it doesn't have to be one person. It could be many people. But it also doesn't have to be many people. It could be one person. There has to be authority, proper authority. Finally, the law must be promulgated. This means to make known by official decree. To make known by official decree. It has to be applied. The principle here is that in order to be held accountable for something, you must know that you are being held accountable for that thing. So knowledge is a precondition of accountability. This is why there are speed limit signs on the road, right? If you're going to get pulled over for violating the speed limit law, you would have to, it's presumed that you would have a good chance of knowing what the law says. Another example is my 2-year-old. I can't expect him to know everything that I know because he's just not old enough. And so if he does something wrong, but he doesn't know that it's wrong, I can't punish him for that. I just have to say, hey, this was wrong. This is why. Don't do this again. For example, leaving the door open and making the other room cold. You know what I mean? He didn't know, his brain isn't sophisticated enough to know that if I leave the door open, he's young. In order to be held accountable for something, you need to be able to know that you are being held accountable for that thing. This has, I think, serious implications for laws today that are so complex that we cannot understand them. How can we be held accountable to laws that we are incapable of knowing? Also note that this doesn't mean that you have to know it in order, it has to be unreasonable ignorance is not an excuse. Okay, so there are 4 essences of law. It took almost the entire class. Congratulations. Let's briefly talk about the 4 different kinds of law. They're at the top of everything. The fountainhead, is the eternal law. We'll talk about each of these in turn, but let me just show you this diagram first. To the left, flowing from the eternal law, is the natural law. And from the natural law flows human law. Okay, now let's start back at the top. There's the eternal law, and flowing to the right is the divine law. And then do you see that dotted line with the arrow on it? This is to signify that human law is indirectly based on divine law. What are these 4 things? Let's talk about it. But before we do, let me show you what Aquinas is not saying. Aquinas is not a legal positivist. H.L.A. Hart is perhaps most well known for articulating this theory in 1958. He says in this article, laws are simply the commands of human beings. They are conventional. Thus, there is no necessary connection between law and morality. That is, between law as it is and law as it ought to be. This should sound familiar. It's the argument put forward by Thrasymachus and restated by Glaucon in books 1 and 2 of the Republic. You naive people, they say, you think that laws, there's some sort of order to the universe, that there's right and wrong. There is no such thing as right and wrong. There is only power. Right and wrong is made up by people who have the power. Laws are conventional, and there is no standard outside of human law by which you can condemn or commend that law. But to see the radical claim here, this is saying that if Nazi Germany says that this is the law, then, well, guess what? That's the law, and there is nothing fundamentally unjust about that. Aquinas rejects this. He says rather that everything flows from the eternal law. The eternal law is basically, you might call it divine providence. It's composed of two things. The order of the universe, there is an eternal order of the universe. It's not random. And God is in control. So it is the order of the universe and God's sovereignty over that order. You might think of this in terms of that kid song. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. God is sovereign over an ordered, not random world. The problem that Aquinas addresses is how could this law be promulgated if it is promulgated on people who have not existed always? Like, how could it be eternal if human beings have not always existed? And he replies in question 91, article 1, in the reply to objection 1. So I have the book, that's on page 9. Those things that do not exist in themselves exist in God's presence insofar as they are foreknown and preordained by him. This, according to Romans 4:17, he calls things that are not in the same way as those that are. So that's the eternal conception of God's law has the character of an eternal law, since it is ordered by God toward the governance of those things foreknown by him. What? This makes my mind blow. I mean, this blows my mind every time I read this. You have existed forever in the sense that God foreknew you. So you didn't exist forever in the sense that you had physical substance or that you actually existed. Rather, you were foreknown and preordained by God in his mind. And as an idea, then, you existed. You are foreknown. You existed before you existed. So in God's mind, you existed before in reality you existed. The second is called the natural law. We'll conclude with this and pick it up here on Tuesday, briefly. Aquinas, question 91, article 2. He starts by talking about Scripture. The light of your face is imprinted on us, he quotes the psalmist as saying. I think the best example of the natural law in Scripture is in Romans 2. For when Gentiles who do not have the law of Moses by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law of Moses. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness. The natural law is written on your heart. A standard of right and wrong was imprinted on your heart. Now, this doesn't physically mean that like if you open your heart and there'd be like words on it. Rather, it means that you have a sense of right and wrong simply by existing as human beings. And the evidence for this, and C.S. Lewis does a good job of explaining this, the evidence for this is that, imagine you're on the subway. Remember the time when we got to go on the subway? Imagine you're on the subway and someone comes up to you and slaps you in the face. You'd bristle at that. You'd say, hey, that's wrong. Don't slap me in the face. You don't deserve that, you might say. But do you see that when you're talking about desert, you're talking about what should or should not be the case? You're talking about an ought, a standard of right and wrong that you can appeal to outside of yourself. I'm not talking about desserts like the butter pecan ice cream that I've been eating every night. I've been running too. But rather like what you are deserving of. That anger is a sign that there is some sort of standard of right and wrong to which you are appealing. This standard, it's kind of vague, but this standard of right and wrong is impressed on all of our hearts. This is the natural law. Flowing from this is the human law, and then there's the divine law, which is Scripture. But we'll talk more about that on Tuesday. For Tuesday, please read questions 92, 93, and 94. So in the syllabus, it says just 93 and 94. Sorry, that's wrong. Please read questions 92, 93, and 94. And pay attention to these two questions. How does the law attempt to promote virtue? And what is natural law? Aquinas describes it in another way in article 94. Is that right? I'm looking forward to it. Thank you so much.